when the first civilizations of Terra were young, and humanity had not yet dreamed of the stars, long before the grim darkness of the 41st millennium consumed the galaxy, a being of unimaginable power emerged from the shadows of prehistory. His origins remain shrouded in mystery even to the most learned scholars of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the highest-ranking members of the Ecclesiarchy. But what fragments of knowledge survive paint a picture of an entity who achieved mastery over psychic forces and genetic manipulation when the galaxy itself was in its infancy. To understand the Emperor of mankind, one must first grasp the sheer scope of his existence. While mortal humans measure their lives in decades, and even the longest-lived xeno species count their years in centuries, the Emperor has walked among humanity for over 40,000 years. He has witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, guided the course of human evolution from the shadows, and shaped the destiny of our species through methods both subtle and catastrophic. Archaeological evidence suggests his influence can be traced through every major turning point in human history, from the development of agriculture to the conquest of the stars themselves. The fragments of lore that survive speak of a consciousness that transcends mortal understanding, where ordinary humans possess a single soul. The Emperor is said to be the amalgamation of thousands of ancient shamans who sacrificed themselves in humanity's prehistoric dawn. These wise men and women, the first psychers of our species, foresaw the coming darkness that would threaten humanity's survival. In an act of unparalleled sacrifice, they chose to die as one and be reborn as something greater, something that could stand against the horrors lurking in the space between spaces that mortals call the warp. Yet even this explanation, recorded in the most sacred texts of the Imperium, may be nothing more than a comfortable lie told to minds that cannot comprehend the true nature of their god Emperor. For in the grim darkness of the far future, few beings inspire such contradictory emotions as the Master of Mankind. To his devoted followers, he is the greatest hero humanity has ever produced, the golden savior who lifted our species from the ashes of old night and forged a galaxy-spanning empire in the name of human supremacy. To his enemies, he is the most dangerous tyrant in the galaxy's history, a being whose ambitions know no bounds, and whose methods brook no mercy. The Emperor's true power defies conventional understanding. Psychers across the galaxy speak in hushed tones of his presence in the warp, a blazing star of golden light that burns away the shadows of chaos wherever it touches. His psychic might is so vast that it can be felt across entire star systems, a beacon of hope that guides lost souls through the nightmare realm of the immaterium. Yet this same power has transformed him into something that may no longer be entirely human, a being who views mortal lives as pieces on a cosmic chessboard, where the stakes are nothing less than the survival of our species. But here lies the greatest mystery of all. For 10,000 years the Emperor has sat motionless upon the golden throne, his withered body sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every day. His consciousness fights an eternal war in the depths of the warp, holding back the tide of chaos that would otherwise consume humanity entirely. He is simultaneously the most powerful being in the galaxy, and its most tragic prisoner, a god who rejected godhood now sustained by the faith of trillions who worship him as the divine father of mankind. The Imperium tells its citizens that the Emperor protects them, that his sacrifice ensures their survival in a universe filled with horrors beyond imagination. But what they do not tell them is that the Emperor himself may be the greatest horror of all. For in his quest to save humanity, he has become something that transcends human morality, human compassion, and perhaps even human understanding. He has gazed into the abyss of what humanity might become, and in doing so he may have become that abyss himself. To study the Emperor's story is to confront the fundamental questions that define our species in the 41st millennium. Can a being who has abandoned his humanity truly serve as humanity's protector? Does the preservation of our species justify any sacrifice, any atrocity, any betrayal of the values that once made us human? And perhaps most terrifying of all, what happens when the being we have placed our absolute faith in may himself be the architect of our ultimate damnation? The scholars of the Ordo Malleus have spent centuries attempting to piece together the Emperor's true history, but their investigations have yielded more questions than answers. Ancient texts speak of his presence at crucial moments throughout human history, sometimes as a conqueror, sometimes as a teacher, always as a figure who appears when humanity faces its darkest hour. Yet these same texts contradict each other in fundamental ways, suggesting either that the records have been deliberately falsified, or that the Emperor himself has existed in multiple forms across the millennia. What we do know is that his story is inseparable from humanity's own journey from a single world to a galaxy-spanning civilization. Every triumph of human ingenuity, every moment of transcendence, every step toward our species' ultimate destiny can be traced back to his influence. But so too can every betrayal, every moment of despair, every step toward the darkness that threatens to consume us all. He is the light that guides us through the void, but he is also the shadow that follows in our wake. The Emperor of mankind stands as the ultimate paradox of the 41st millennium. He is humanity's greatest champion and its most terrible burden, a savior whose methods are indistinguishable from those of the enemies he fights. A God who embodies both the highest aspirations and the darkest impulses of our species. His story is our story, written in blood and fire across the stars, and its ending remains shrouded in the same mystery that has surrounded him since the dawn of human civilization. But to understand what the Emperor has become, we must first understand what he was, and what forces shaped the galaxy he would one day rule. We must journey back to an age when Terra itself was nothing more than a battlefield, when humanity's future hung in the balance, and when the being who would become the master of mankind first emerged from the shadows to claim his destiny among the stars. The galaxy that would one day bow before the Emperor's golden legions was a vastly different place in the dark millennia preceding his rise to power. To comprehend the magnitude of his achievement, one must first understand the apocalyptic conditions that prevailed across human space during the period historians call the Age of Strife, a time when humanity's first stellar civilization collapsed into ruin and madness. Between the 25th and 30th millennia, the galaxy had become a charnel house of human ambition. The Dark Age of technology, that golden epoch when humanity had mastered the secrets of the universe and spread across the stars like a conquering tide, had ended in catastrophe beyond imagination. Warp storms of unprecedented ferocity erupted across the galaxy, tearing through the fabric of space-time itself and severing the vital links between human worlds. What had once been a unified stellar civilization, fragmented into 10,000 isolated kingdoms, each fighting desperately for survival in a universe that had suddenly become hostile to human life. The statistics of this collapse paint a picture of devastation that defies comprehension. Archaeological evidence suggests that at the height of the Dark Age of technology, humanity controlled over 20 million worlds with a total population exceeding 100 trillion souls. By the time the Age of Strife reached its nadir, fewer than 1 million human worlds remained inhabited, and the total population had crashed to perhaps 10 billion desperate survivors scattered across the galaxy's spiral arms. On Terra itself, the cradle of human civilization had become a wasteland of competing techno-barbarian kingdoms. The planet's surface, once a garden world of impossible beauty, had been scarred by millennia of warfare using weapons that could crack continents and boil oceans. Radiation storms swept across vast deserts of fused glass where once mighty cities had stood. The air itself had become poisonous in many regions, forcing survivors to huddle in underground bunkers or sealed arcologies that functioned more like prisons than sanctuaries. The techno-barbarian warlords, who ruled these scattered domains, possessed fragments of humanity's lost technological heritage, but they wielded these gifts like savages playing with the weapons of gods. Primitive fusion reactors powered armies of cybernetically enhanced warriors who rode into battle on gravitic platforms while wielding weapons that could cut through tank armor like paper. Yet for all their technological prowess, these warlords understood nothing of the principles that governed their weapons, treating them as magical artifacts rather than products of human ingenuity. But technology was not the only force reshaping human civilization during this dark age. The emergence of psychers among the human population had begun to accelerate at an alarming rate, with mutation rates increasing exponentially with each passing generation. Where once psychic abilities had been rare gifts possessed by perhaps 1 in a million humans by the closing centuries of the Age of Strife, nearly 1 in every 1,000 children was born with some degree of psychic sensitivity. This proliferation of psychic talent brought with it dangers that humanity was utterly unprepared to face. The warp, that parallel dimension through which faster-than-light travel had once been possible, had become a realm of pure nightmare. Entities of malevolent intelligence dwelt in its depths, ancient powers that fed on emotion and suffering. And they had learned to use human psykers as gateways into the material universe. Entire worlds had been consumed by demonic invasions, their populations either slaughtered or worse, transformed into willing servants of the ruinous powers. The few human worlds that survived this psychic plague did so only by implementing the most draconian measures imaginable. Psykers were hunted down and killed on sight, their bodies burned to prevent any possibility of posthumous corruption. Entire bloodlines were exterminated if they showed even the slightest sign of psychic contamination. Libraries were burned, scholars executed, and any knowledge that might lead to psychic awakening was systematically destroyed. Humanity was deliberately choosing ignorance over extinction, abandoning the very curiosity and intellectual drive that had once lifted them to the stars. Terra's population during this period fluctuated wildly, with estimates ranging from as few as 6 billion to as many as 40 billion souls, depending on the frequency and intensity of the wars that periodically swept across the planet's surface. These conflicts were fought with a bewildering array of weapons, from crude slug throwers salvaged from ancient armories to exotic energy weapons that could disintegrate matter at the molecular level. The result was a constant state of low-level warfare punctuated by brief periods of exhausted peace. The planet's ecosystem had been so thoroughly devastated that natural weather patterns had ceased to exist in many regions. Artificial climate control systems, remnants of the dark age of technology, struggled to maintain habitable conditions, but they were failing one by one as the knowledge needed to maintain them was lost. Vast atmospheric processors belched toxic fumes into the sky, while ancient terraforming engines continued to operate according to programming that no living human understood. Yet even in this nightmare landscape, signs of a greater intelligence at work were beginning to manifest. Archaeological evidence from this period shows curious patterns in the rise and fall of various techno-barbarian kingdoms. Certain bloodlines seemed to possess an uncanny ability to survive while others perished. Specific technologies appeared and disappeared with suspicious regularity, as if someone was carefully managing the flow of knowledge to prevent any single faction from gaining too much power. Fragmentary records speak of mysterious figures who appeared at crucial moments during this dark age, advisors and warriors who seemed to possess knowledge far beyond their apparent station. These individuals bore different names and faces, but they shared certain characteristics that would later become associated with the emperor himself. They were invariably tall, possessed of a commanding presence that inspired both loyalty and fear, and they demonstrated an intimate knowledge of both technology and the psychic arts that far exceeded anything their contemporaries could achieve. The growing frequency of these appearances suggests that something was stirring in the depths of human civilization, some force that had been preparing for this moment across the long millennia of darkness. While the techno-barbarian warlords fought their petty wars and the scattered human colonies struggled for survival, a greater game was being played, one whose rules and objectives remained hidden from mortal understanding. The conditions that prevailed during the Age of Strife were not merely the result of random catastrophe, but represented a crucial test of humanity's worthiness to inherit the galaxy. The species that emerged from this crucible would be fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. Hardened by suffering and purified by fire, they would be ready to follow a leader who promised not merely survival, but dominion over the stars themselves. As the 30th millennium approached, the storms that had raged across the galaxy for 5,000 years began to show signs of abating. The warp, while still dangerous, was no longer the impassable barrier it had been during the worst years of the Age of Strife. Communication between distant worlds became possible once again, and with it came the first stirrings of hope that humanity might yet reclaim its lost heritage. It was into this world of desperate hope and lingering terror that the Emperor would emerge, not as a savior descending from the heavens, but as a conqueror rising from the very heart of Terra's devastation. The stage was set for the greatest transformation in human history, and the mysterious figure who had walked among humanity for 40 millennia was finally ready to reveal himself to the galaxy. The transformation of Terra from a war-torn wasteland into the beating heart of a galactic empire did not happen overnight, nor did it follow the dramatic arc that imperial propaganda would later claim. Instead, it was a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries, as one techno-barbarian kingdom after another fell to the advancing forces of a warlord who called himself simply the Emperor of Mankind. The first reliable records of the Emperor's military campaigns date to the late 29th millennium, when a previously unknown faction began expanding outward from the Himalayan regions of Terra. Unlike the crude tribal confederations that had dominated the planet for millennia, this new force displayed a level of organization and technological sophistication that set it apart from all its competitors. Their armies moved with precision and purpose, their weapons functioned with deadly efficiency, and their soldiers displayed a fanatical loyalty that bordered on religious devotion. What made this expansion particularly remarkable was not its speed, but its methodology. Where other warlords had relied on brute force and terror to subdue their enemies, the Emperor's forces employed a sophisticated combination of military pressure, technological superiority, and psychological warfare. Enemy commanders found themselves facing not just superior firepower, but superior intelligence, as if their opponent possessed detailed knowledge of their plans before they had even been conceived. The Emperor's early victories were achieved through the deployment of genetically enhanced warriors known as Thunder Warriors, the first successful attempt to create superhuman soldiers since the Dark Age of technology. These towering figures stood nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies enhanced with crude but effective genetic modifications that granted them strength, speed, and endurance far beyond normal human limits. More importantly, they possessed an absolute loyalty to their creator that made them immune to the corruption and betrayal that had plagued other military forces throughout the Age of Strife. Archaeological evidence from battlefields across Terra reveals the devastating effectiveness of these enhanced warriors. Weapons that could penetrate power armor left barely a scratch on their modified bone structure. Toxins that would kill normal humans in seconds were metabolized harmlessly by their enhanced biology. They could fight for days without rest, survive wounds that would cripple ordinary soldiers, and maintain perfect discipline even in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet the Thunder Warriors represented more than just a military innovation. They were proof that the Emperor possessed knowledge of genetic manipulation that exceeded anything achieved during the Dark Age of technology. The techniques required to create stable genetic modifications in adult humans had been lost for millennia. Yet the Emperor not only rediscovered them but improved upon them. This suggested that he had access to either preserved Dark Age archives or possessed an understanding of biology that transcended conventional scientific knowledge. The expanding influence of the Emperor's forces began to attract attention from other powerful factions on Terra. The Mechanicum of Mars, that ancient cult of tech priests who had maintained their independence throughout the Age of Strife, sent emissaries to investigate this new player in the game of planetary politics. What they discovered both fascinated and terrified them in equal measure. The Emperor's technology was clearly superior to anything the Mechanicum possessed, yet it did not follow the established patterns of Dark Age science. His weapons were more efficient, his vehicles more reliable, and his manufacturing processes more sophisticated than anything in the Mechanicum's archives. More disturbing still, he seemed to understand the fundamental principles governing these technologies, rather than simply copying ancient designs. This suggested that he was not merely a techno-barbarian who had stumbled upon a forgotten cache of weapons, but a being who possessed an intuitive understanding of the universe's deepest secrets. The recognition of the Emperor's capabilities led to increasingly complex negotiations between his forces and the various factions that still controlled significant portions of Terra. Some warlords attempted to form alliances with him, hoping to share in his apparent success. Others declared holy wars against him, viewing his rapid expansion as a threat to their own domains. Most simply tried to avoid his attention, hoping that he would be content with his current territories and leave them in peace. All of these approaches proved equally futile. The Emperor's expansion followed a pattern that suggested he was working toward a specific goal rather than simply accumulating territory for its own sake. His forces concentrated on securing key strategic locations, particularly those that possessed functional infrastructure from the Dark Age of technology. Spaceports, communications arrays, and manufacturing facilities received priority attention, while less important settlements were often left untouched, provided they did not interfere with his larger objectives. This strategic focus revealed a level of long-term planning that was unprecedented among Terra's warlords. Where other conquerors had been content to rule over the ruins of previous civilizations, the Emperor seemed determined to rebuild human civilization from the ground up. His engineers worked tirelessly to restore damaged infrastructure. His scientists labored to rediscover lost technologies, and his administrators implemented governance systems that actually functioned effectively rather than simply extracting resources from conquered populations. The psychological impact of these achievements, began to resonate far beyond the territories directly under the Emperor's control. For the first time in millennia, humans could see evidence that their species was capable of something greater than mere survival. The Emperor's domains became beacons of hope in a world that had almost forgotten what hope looked like, attracting refugees, scientists, and warriors from across the planet. Yet for all his apparent benevolence, there were disturbing aspects to the Emperor's rule that suggested a ruthlessness that exceeded even that of the most brutal techno-barbarian warlords. Entire populations that resisted his authority simply vanished, leaving behind only empty cities and fragmentary records of their existence. Scientists who failed to meet his expectations disappeared into secret laboratories, never to be seen again. Even his own Thunder Warriors, for all their enhanced capabilities, seemed to age rapidly and suffer from genetic instabilities that suggested their creator viewed them as expendable tools rather than living beings. The growing recognition of the Emperor's true nature began to create a paradox that would define his relationship with humanity for the next 10,000 years. He was simultaneously humanity's greatest champion and its most terrible master, a being who promised to elevate the species to unprecedented heights while demanding absolute submission to his will. Those who served him faithfully were rewarded with prosperity and purpose beyond their wildest dreams. Those who opposed him were crushed with a thoroughness that served as a warning to all who might consider resistance. As the 30th millennium approached, it became clear that the Emperor's expansion was entering a new phase. The scattered techno-barbarian kingdoms that had once seemed so formidable were revealing themselves to be nothing more than obstacles to be swept aside. The real test of the Emperor's vision would come not in conquering Terra, but in extending his influence beyond the boundaries of humanity's homeworld. The stage was being set for the next phase of the Emperor's grand design, one that would see him transform from a planetary conqueror into the master of a galactic empire. But first, he would need to demonstrate that his power extended beyond the mere manipulation of genetic material and primitive technology. He would need to prove that he could command forces that transcended the material universe itself, and that his vision for humanity's future was worth the terrible price that would be demanded of all who followed him. The true scope of the Emperor's abilities became apparent not through any single dramatic revelation, but through a series of incidents that gradually revealed powers that transcended conventional understanding of human capability. As his forces consolidated control over ever larger portions of Terra, witnesses began to report phenomena that could not be explained by even the most advanced technologies of the Dark Age. The first documented evidence of the Emperor's psychic abilities comes from the archives of the Terran warband known as the Crimson Eagles, a techno-barbarian tribe that controlled a significant portion of the former European continent. Their war leaders had initially dismissed reports of the Emperor's supernatural powers as primitive superstition, but their skepticism evaporated during the siege of the Gibraltar Fortress in 798-M30. According to surviving records, the Emperor appeared alone before the fortress gates, protected by nothing more than a simple robe and carrying no visible weapons. When the defenders opened fire with weapons capable of leveling city blocks, the energy bolts simply stopped in mid-air, frozen as if time itself had been suspended. The Emperor then spoke a single word, and every weapon in the fortress simultaneously ceased to function. The massive blast doors, each weighing several thousand tons and secured by mechanisms that had resisted attack for centuries, opened at his approach as if they were nothing more than ceremonial barriers. The psychological impact of this demonstration was even more devastating than its physical effects. The fortress garrison, hardened warriors who had fought through decades of constant warfare, found themselves unable to raise their weapons against the Emperor. They described an overwhelming sense of awe and recognition, as if they were in the presence of something that transcended human understanding. Within hours, the entire fortress had surrendered without a single shot being fired. Similar incidents began to occur with increasing frequency as the Emperor's campaigns expanded across Terra. Enemy commanders reported that their battle plans seemed to be known to the Emperor before they had even been conceived. Assassination attempts failed as the would-be killers found themselves unable to approach their target, as if some invisible force was protecting him. Most disturbing of all, captured prisoners spoke of dreams in which the Emperor appeared to them, offering them a choice between service and oblivion. The theological implications of these reports were not lost on the various cults and religious movements that still flourished in Terra's underground cities. Many began to proclaim that the emperor was the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, a divine figure who had come to lead humanity out of the darkness of the Age of Strife. Others declared him to be a demon in human form, a creature of the warp that had taken on the appearance of a savior to better deceive his victims. The emperor's response to these competing interpretations was characteristically pragmatic. He neither encouraged worship nor explicitly forbade it, instead focusing on the practical requirements of rebuilding human civilization. His public pronouncements emphasized reason, science, and human achievement rather than divine intervention or supernatural powers. Yet his private actions suggested a being who understood the power of faith and was not above using it to achieve his objectives. The most significant demonstration of the emperor's capabilities came during the negotiations with the Mechanicum of Mars, the ancient cult of tech priests who had maintained their independence throughout the Age of Strife. These negotiations represented the first formal diplomatic contact between Terra and another world in over 5 millennia, and their outcome would determine whether the emperor's vision could extend beyond the boundaries of humanity's homeworld. The Mechanicum's representatives arrived on Terra, expecting to encounter another techno-barbarian warlord, perhaps more sophisticated than most, but ultimately limited by the same constraints that had bound all of Terra's rulers since the collapse of the Dark Age of technology. What they found instead was a being who possessed not only advanced technology, but an understanding of its fundamental principles that exceeded their own considerable knowledge. During the formal negotiations, the emperor demonstrated his mastery of technologies that the Mechanicum had spent millennia trying to rediscover. He repaired a damaged servitor with a touch, caused defunct machinery to function with a word, and answered questions about the nature of reality that had puzzled the tech priests for generations. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand the machine god that the Mechanicum worshipped, speaking of it not as an abstract concept but as a tangible force that could be channeled and directed. The treaty that emerged from these negotiations, known as the Treaty of Mars, represented more than just a military alliance. It was a recognition that the emperor possessed capabilities that transcended normal human limitations, capabilities that might be sufficient to restore humanity to its former glory. The Mechanicum agreed to provide the emperor with their most advanced technologies and manufacturing capabilities, while the emperor promised to lead humanity in a Great Crusade to reclaim the stars. Yet even as the emperor's power was being recognized and celebrated, there were disturbing signs that suggested the true cost of his abilities. The Thunder Warriors who had served him so faithfully during the Unification Wars began to exhibit signs of genetic instability. Their enhanced biology, which had made them nearly invincible in battle, was breaking down at an accelerated rate. Many died from organ failure, others from cancers that consumed their modified tissues, and still others from psychological disorders that drove them to madness. The emperor's response to these developments was coldly practical. Rather than attempting to cure the Thunder Warriors' ailments, he began the process of replacing them with a new generation of enhanced soldiers. These new warriors, who would later be known as the Astartes or Space Marines, were created using more advanced genetic techniques that promised greater stability and longevity. The Thunder Warriors were quietly retired from active service, their fate remaining a closely guarded secret that would haunt the Imperium for millennia to come. The creation of the Space Marines represented a quantum leap in the Emperor's genetic manipulation capabilities. Where the Thunder Warriors had been crude prototypes, the Astartes were precision instruments of war, their bodies modified with 19 separate organ implants that granted them superhuman capabilities while maintaining psychological stability. The process of creating these modifications required knowledge of genetics and biology that had been lost during the Dark Age of technology. Yet the Emperor seemed to possess this knowledge as if it were second nature. More disturbing still was the Emperor's apparent ability to create beings that were more than merely enhanced humans. His personal guards, known as the Custodians, were crafted individually using techniques that were beyond even the Mechanicum's understanding. Each Custodian was unique, their genetic modifications tailored to their specific role and personality. They possessed not only physical capabilities that exceeded even the Space Marines, but also an intuitive understanding of the Emperor's will that allowed them to anticipate his needs without conscious communication. The escalating complexity of the Emperor's genetic creations suggested that he was working towards some greater purpose, one that required him to perfect the art of creating superhuman beings. The scattered hints and fragmentary records from this period speak of a project of unprecedented scope and ambition, one that would require the Emperor to create beings capable of commanding entire armies and governing vast territories with absolute authority. The reactions from other factions to these developments varied dramatically. Some saw the Emperor's growing power as proof that humanity was finally ready to reclaim its rightful place among the stars. Others viewed his abilities with suspicion and fear, recognizing that a being capable of creating superhuman soldiers might pose a threat to human freedom itself. Most simply watched and waited, hoping to determine whether the Emperor's vision was worth the terrible price that seemed to be demanded of all who served him. As the 30th millennium drew to a close, it became clear that the Emperor's emergence marked the end of one age and the beginning of another. The scattered techno-barbarian kingdoms that had dominated Terra for millennia were being swept aside by forces that operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding. The Emperor was no longer merely a conqueror seeking to expand his territory, but a transformative force that was reshaping the very nature of human civilization. The stage was set for the next phase of the Emperor's grand design, one that would see him extend his influence beyond Terra to encompass the entire galaxy. But first, he would need to create the instruments of conquest that would allow him to achieve his ultimate vision. The greatest of these instruments would be his sons, the Primarchs, beings who would combine the best aspects of human nature with power that rivaled his own. Their creation would represent the pinnacle of the Emperor's achievements, but it would also plant the seeds of the greatest betrayal in human history. The period historians call the Great Crusade represents the apex of human achievement in the galaxy's recorded history. Between the years 798.M30 and 005, M31, a span of barely 2.5 centuries, the Emperor transformed humanity from a species barely clinging to survival on a single world into the masters of a million-world empire that stretched across the galaxy. This unprecedented expansion was made possible by the Emperor's greatest creation and his most terrible mistake, the 20 beings known as the Primarchs. The Primarchs were the Emperor's attempt to create the perfect fusion of human leadership and superhuman capability. Each was designed to embody specific aspects of human excellence, from strategic brilliance to technological innovation to sheer physical prowess. They were not merely enhanced humans like the Space Marines, but beings who had been crafted at the genetic level to serve as generals, governors, and ultimately, the inheritors of the Emperor's galactic empire. The creation process itself remains shrouded in mystery, but fragmentary records suggest that the Emperor drew upon knowledge and techniques that transcended conventional science. Each Primarch was individually designed using genetic material that may have included the Emperor's own biological essence, combined with influences from the warp itself. The result was 20 beings who possessed not only superhuman physical capabilities but also intuitive understanding of leadership, strategy, and the arts of war that seemed to come from some deeper source than mere training. The most remarkable aspect of the Primarchs was their diversity. Where the Thunder Warriors had been crude copies of the same basic template, each Primarch was unique, designed to excel in different aspects of human endeavor. Robout Guilliman possessed an unparalleled gift for organization and administration, capable of governing entire star systems with efficiency that exceeded even the most advanced artificial intelligences. Horus demonstrated a charisma and strategic brilliance that made him a natural leader of leaders, able to inspire absolute loyalty in beings who were themselves superhuman. Sanguinius embodied the noblest aspects of human nature, his very presence inspiring hope and courage in the darkest circumstances. Yet, for all their individual excellence, the Primarchs were designed to function as a collective entity, each complementing the other's strengths and compensating for their weaknesses. The Emperor's vision was of a ruling council of superhuman beings who would govern the galaxy according to principles of reason, efficiency, and human supremacy. They would be his instruments of conquest during the Great Crusade, and his viceroys during the Golden Age of Peace that would follow. The organizational structure of the Great Crusade reflected this philosophy of superhuman leadership governing enhanced human forces. Each Primarch commanded a legion of Space Marines created from their own genetic material, resulting in forces that possessed not only superhuman capabilities but also psychological compatibility with their leaders. The Ultramarines of the 13th Legion shared Guilliman's gift for organization and tactical flexibility. The Blood Angels of the IF's Legion embodied Sanguinius's nobility and artistic sensibility. The Luna Wolves of the X-5th Legion reflected Horus's charisma and aggressive confidence. The technological mastery that made the Great Crusade possible was equally impressive. The Emperor's alliance with the Mechanicum of Mars had provided him with access to manufacturing capabilities that could produce weapons, vehicles, and equipment on a scale that dwarfed even the achievements of the Dark Age of technology. Entire Forge worlds were dedicated to producing the materials needed for the Crusade, their foundries working continuously to supply the millions of soldiers who would carry the Emperor's banner to the stars. The weapons and equipment produced during this period represented the pinnacle of human technological achievement. Bolt guns that could penetrate any known armor, power armor that could withstand direct hits from weapons capable of destroying buildings, and vehicles that could operate in environments ranging from the depths of space to the surfaces of volcanic worlds. Most remarkably, all of this technology was designed to be maintainable and repairable by human technicians, ensuring that the Emperor's forces could operate independently for extended periods without requiring support from Terra. The philosophical foundation of the Great Crusade was the imperial truth, a comprehensive ideology that emphasized reason, science, and human achievement while rejecting superstition, religion, and belief in the supernatural. The Emperor presented himself not as a god to be worshipped, but as the ultimate expression of human potential, a being who had achieved mastery over the natural world through the application of scientific principles and rational thought. This ideology was designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. It provided a unifying belief system that could bind together humans from thousands of different worlds and cultures. It offered a framework for governance that emphasized efficiency and progress over tradition and superstition. Most importantly, it was intended to starve the chaos gods of the emotional energy they required to maintain their influence over the material universe. The Emperor's understanding of the warp and its inhabitants was far more sophisticated than most of his followers realized. He knew that the entities humans called daemons were not supernatural beings but psychic parasites that fed on emotion and belief. By promoting a strictly rational worldview that denied the existence of gods and spirits, he hoped to weaken the chaos gods sufficiently to allow humanity to expand across the galaxy without interference from the denizens of the warp. The early years of the Great Crusade seemed to vindicate this approach completely. Human colonies that had been isolated for millennia were brought back into the fold of human civilization. Alien empires that had oppressed human populations for generations were swept aside by the Emperor's forces. Technologies that had been lost during the Age of Strife were rediscovered and improved upon. For the first time in human history, it seemed possible that the species might achieve true mastery over the galaxy. Yet even during this golden age, there were signs that the Emperor's vision contained fundamental flaws that would eventually undermine everything he had built. The Primarchs, for all their superhuman capabilities, remained essentially human in their emotional needs and psychological vulnerabilities. They craved their father's approval and recognition, but the Emperor's focus on the larger goals of the Crusade left little time for the personal relationships that his sons desperately needed. The rigid adherence to the imperial truth also created its own problems. By denying the existence of the warp's inhabitants, the Emperor left his forces vulnerable to corruption and manipulation by entities they had been taught did not exist. The Chaos Gods, far from being weakened by humanity's rational worldview, began to adapt their strategies to exploit the very rationality that was supposed to protect their victims. Most troubling of all was the Emperor's increasing isolation from the day-to-day operations of the Crusade. As the scope of the campaign expanded beyond what any single being could manage, he began to delegate more and more authority to his Primarchs and their subordinates. This delegation was necessary for practical reasons, but it also created distance between the Emperor and the forces carrying out his vision. The personal charisma and inspirational presence that had unified humanity during the early years of the Crusade were gradually replaced by institutional authority and bureaucratic efficiency. The hidden vulnerabilities in the Emperor's system became apparent during the latter years of the Great Crusade. As the pace of expansion began to slow and the challenges of governing a galaxy-spanning empire became increasingly apparent, the Primarchs, who had been designed to serve as conquerors, found themselves struggling with the mundane tasks of administration and governance. Some, like Guilliman, adapted successfully to these new responsibilities. Others, like Angron and Kurz, found the transition from warrior to administrator deeply frustrating. The Emperor's response to these challenges was characteristically pragmatic, but ultimately short-sighted. Rather than addressing the underlying problems with his system, he chose to withdraw from active leadership of the Crusade to pursue what he claimed was a more important project. This decision, which he justified as necessary for humanity's long-term survival, would prove to be the first step toward the greatest catastrophe in human history. The Golden Age of the Great Crusade was built on foundations that seemed unshakable at the time but contained within them the seeds of their own destruction. The Emperor's vision of a rational, scientific civilization governed by superhuman beings was magnificent in its scope and ambition, but it failed to account for the basic human needs for meaning, purpose, and spiritual fulfillment that no amount of technological advancement could satisfy. As the 31st millennium approached, the Emperor's great work was approaching completion. The galaxy had been conquered, humanity's enemies had been defeated, and the foundation of a golden age had been laid. Yet the very success of the Great Crusade had created new problems that would prove far more dangerous than any external threat. The Emperor's sons were growing increasingly restless, his forces were becoming complacent, and the enemies he thought he had defeated were preparing to strike back in ways that would challenge everything he had built. The stage was set for the greatest test of the Emperor's vision, one that would determine whether his dream of human supremacy would endure for 10,000 years, or collapse into the nightmare of civil war and eternal conflict. The foundations of the Golden Age were complete, but they were about to be tested by forces that would reveal whether they were strong enough to support the weight of a galactic empire. The Great Crusade's expansion across the galaxy during the early 31st millennium represented more than mere military conquest. It was the systematic implementation of a philosophical revolution that sought to transform not just the political landscape of the galaxy, but the very nature of human consciousness itself. The Emperor's vision extended far beyond the simple accumulation of territory to encompass a complete restructuring of how humanity understood its place in the universe. The core philosophy driving this expansion was the concept of human supremacy tempered by rational enlightenment. Unlike the crude xenophobia that had characterized many of humanity's earlier conflicts, the Emperor's approach was based on what he claimed were objective assessments of each species' potential for coexistence with human civilization. Alien races that could be integrated into the Imperium's structure were offered the opportunity to become vassals or client species. Those that posed a fundamental threat to human development were targeted for systematic elimination. This approach yielded remarkable results during the Crusade's expansion phase. The Lavar civilization, with its advanced biotechnology and aesthetic sensibilities, was initially considered for integration until their hedonistic practices and psychic corruption became apparent. The Interrex, a human civilization that had successfully coexisted with several alien species for millennia, presented a more complex challenge that required careful negotiation and ultimately tragic misunderstanding. The Orc empires, with their instinctive aggression and technological unpredictability, were marked for total war as soon as contact was established. Each successful compliance brought new resources, technologies, and populations into the growing Imperium, but it also brought new challenges that tested the flexibility and adaptability of the Emperor's system. The diversity of human cultures that had evolved during the Age of Strife was staggering in its scope and complexity. Some worlds had developed into techno-barbarian states similar to pre-Unification Terra. Others had achieved levels of technological sophistication that rivaled or exceeded the Dark Age of technology. Still others had regressed to medieval or even primitive conditions, their populations struggling to survive in environments that had been poisoned by ancient wars or natural disasters. The process of integrating these diverse civilizations into a unified imperial structure required a delicate balance between respect for local customs and enforcement of imperial law. The Emperor's approach was characteristically pragmatic, allowing considerable autonomy to worlds that could demonstrate their loyalty and productivity while imposing direct imperial control on those that showed signs of instability or corruption. This flexibility was one of the Great Crusade's greatest strengths, but it also created inconsistencies and contradictions that would later prove problematic. The reactions from other galactic powers to the Imperium's expansion varied dramatically depending on their own capabilities and strategic positions. The Eldar, ancient and declining but still possessing technologies that exceeded human understanding, initially attempted to manipulate the Crusade's direction through subtle influence and misdirection. Their efforts to guide human expansion away from certain regions of the galaxy suggested knowledge of threats that the Emperor himself might not have fully understood. The Orc empires responded to imperial expansion with characteristic enthusiasm, viewing the appearance of a new enemy as an opportunity for bigger and better fights. This reaction was precisely what imperial strategists had expected. and orc space became a testing ground for new weapons and tactics that would later be employed against more sophisticated opponents. The seemingly endless conflicts with orc forces also provided valuable combat experience for newly recruited Space Marine legions. More troubling were the encounters with human civilizations that had developed along lines that fundamentally contradicted Imperial philosophy. The techno-barbarian kingdoms of the Galactos cluster had maintained their independence by embracing psychic powers and warp-based technologies that the Imperial truth explicitly rejected. The harrowing wars required 3 full legions to complete compliance, and even then, significant portions of the population had to be relocated or subjected to memory modification to ensure their loyalty. The growing complexity of these compliance campaigns began to strain the resources and organizational capabilities of even the most efficient legions. What had initially been conceived as a relatively straightforward process of liberation and integration was revealing itself to be an undertaking of unprecedented complexity that required not just military might but diplomatic skill, cultural sensitivity, and administrative expertise that few of the Primarchs possessed in equal measure. The Emperor's response to these challenges was to delegate increasing authority to those Primarchs who demonstrated particular aptitude for specific types of operations. Horus emerged as the natural choice for overall strategic coordination, his charisma and political acumen making him invaluable in negotiations with powerful human civilizations. Guilliman's administrative genius made him the obvious choice for post-compliance governance and integration. The Lion's tactical brilliance and psychological intimidation were perfectly suited for campaigns against more aggressive alien civilizations. This specialization of roles initially improved the efficiency of Crusade operations, but it also began to create subtle hierarchies and divisions among the Primarchs that had not existed during the early years of the campaign. Some, like Lorgar, found their talents less valued in a crusade that increasingly emphasized military efficiency over cultural integration. Others, like Angron, discovered that their particular gifts for violence and intimidation were considered useful but distasteful by their more politically sophisticated brothers. The philosophical implications of these developments were not lost on the more intellectually inclined Primarchs. Magnus the Red, with his deep understanding of psychic phenomena and warp-based technologies, began to question whether the Imperial truth's rejection of all supernatural forces was ultimately sustainable in a galaxy where psychic powers were an increasingly common feature of human evolution. His private correspondence with other Primarchs during this period reveals growing concerns about the long-term viability of the Emperor's ideological framework. Lorgar's reactions were even more troubling from the Emperor's perspective. The Primarch of the Word-Bearers had always been more interested in the spiritual and philosophical aspects of the Great Crusade than in its military objectives. His attempts to establish worship of the Emperor as a central tenet of Imperial culture were repeatedly rejected, but his underlying concerns about the spiritual vacuum created by the Imperial truth continued to resonate with many of his brother Primarchs. The Emperor's handling of these philosophical challenges revealed both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. His ability to see the larger strategic picture and understand the long-term implications of current events was unparalleled, but his emotional distance from his sons left him unable to address their personal doubts and concerns in ways that might have prevented future problems. He treated their questions as intellectual exercises rather than emotional needs, providing logical explanations when what they required was understanding and reassurance. The spreading influence of Imperial culture also began to encounter resistance from more subtle sources than military opposition or political disagreement. The Chaos Gods, those ancient entities that fed on emotion and belief, had not been idle during the Great Crusade's expansion. They had been carefully studying the Emperor's methods and philosophy, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited to corrupt his grand design. The Imperial truth's emphasis on rationality and rejection of superstition had indeed reduced the emotional energy available to the Chaos Gods, but it had also created a psychological vacuum that they could fill with alternatives that appeared to be rational and scientific rather than supernatural. The pursuit of perfection could be corrupted into obsessive pursuit of sensation and experience. The desire for efficiency could be twisted into an embrace of decay and entropy. The need for order could be perverted into mindless rage and violence. These corrupting influences began to manifest in subtle ways that were initially dismissed as isolated incidents or normal variations in human behavior. Certain compliance campaigns took longer than expected due to unexplained equipment failures and communication breakdowns. Some newly integrated populations displayed unusual levels of aggression or hedonistic behavior that required additional pacification efforts. Most troubling of all, a few Space Marine units began to exhibit psychological instabilities that could not be explained by their genetic conditioning or training. The Emperor was aware of these developments, but his focus on the larger strategic picture prevented him from recognizing their true significance. He attributed them to the normal growing pains of a rapidly expanding empire rather than evidence of deliberate corruption by external forces. This miscalculation would prove to be one of the most consequential errors in human history. As the Great Crusade approached the end of its 2nd century, the signs of growing problems were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The pace of expansion was slowing, as the remaining unconquered regions of the galaxy consisted primarily of heavily defended strongholds or territories that posed significant logistical challenges. The administrative burden of governing a million-world empire was beginning to overwhelm even the most efficient imperial institutions. Most ominously, the Primarchs themselves were showing signs of restlessness and dissatisfaction that suggested deeper problems with the Emperor's vision. The stage was being set for a crisis that would test every aspect of the Emperor's grand design. The philosophical foundations of the Imperium were about to encounter challenges that would reveal whether they were strong enough to support the weight of a galactic civilization, or whether they contained fundamental flaws that would lead to their collapse. The spreading influence of imperial culture had created the largest human empire in galactic history, but it had also created conditions that would make the coming catastrophe all the more devastating when it finally arrived. The corruption that would ultimately tear the Imperium apart did not announce itself with dramatic revelations or obvious signs of decay. Instead, it crept into the Emperor's great work through 1,000 tiny compromises, each seemingly insignificant in isolation, but collectively representing a fundamental assault on the philosophical foundations of human civilization. The first signs appeared during the later years of the Great Crusade, when the pace of expansion had slowed and the challenges of governance had begun to strain the system beyond its original design parameters. The earliest anomalies were so subtle that they were initially dismissed as statistical variations within acceptable parameters. Medical records from several Space Marine legions began to show slight increases in psychological disorders that had previously been virtually unknown among the Emperor's enhanced warriors. Battle brothers who had served with distinction for decades suddenly developed obsessive behaviors that interfered with their combat effectiveness. Others exhibited mood swings and emotional instability that seemed inconsistent with their genetic conditioning and psychological training. The apothecaries responsible for monitoring the health of the legions initially attributed these problems to combat stress and the accumulated effects of extended campaigning. Space Marines were superhuman, but they were not immune to psychological trauma, and the scale of the Great Crusade had subjected them to experiences that exceeded even their enhanced capacity for adaptation. This explanation was accepted without question by most imperial authorities, who were already dealing with more pressing concerns related to the administration of newly conquered territories. More troubling were the reports beginning to emerge from newly compliant worlds regarding the behavior of imperial forces during and after conquest. The Space Marine legions had always been ruthless in their prosecution of war, but their methods had been controlled and purposeful, designed to minimize unnecessary destruction while achieving strategic objectives. Now, however, scattered reports suggested that some units were engaging in excessive violence that served no military purpose and actually hindered post-compliance integration efforts. The Iron Hands Legion, known for their mechanical precision and logical approach to warfare, began to exhibit an obsession with technological augmentation that went far beyond their traditional embrace of cybernetic enhancement. Individual Marines were discovered to have replaced perfectly functional biological components with mechanical alternatives, often without authorization from their superiors. When questioned about these modifications, they provided explanations that emphasized the superiority of machine over flesh in terms that seemed almost religious in their fervor. The Emperor's children, previously celebrated for their pursuit of perfection in all aspects of warfare and culture, began to demonstrate behaviors that suggested their definition of perfection was evolving in disturbing directions. Their combat techniques became increasingly elaborate and ritualistic, prioritizing aesthetic considerations over tactical effectiveness. Their art and music, once expressions of noble human achievement, began to incorporate themes and imagery that many observers found deeply unsettling. The growing frequency of these incidents began to attract the attention of imperial authorities, who who were responsible for monitoring the effectiveness and loyalty of the legions. Investigative teams were dispatched to examine the most serious cases, but their findings only deepened the mystery. Medical examinations revealed no obvious physical causes for the behavioral changes. Psychological evaluation uncovered no evidence of deliberate disloyalty or corruption. The affected Marines seemed genuinely convinced that their actions were consistent with their duties and obligations to the Emperor. Failed explanations proliferated as Imperial scientists and administrators struggled to understand what was happening to the Emperor's most elite forces. Some suggested that the genetic modifications that created the Space Marines contained flaws that only manifested after extended periods of combat stress. Others proposed that exposure to alien technologies and environments during the Crusade had introduced unknown contamination that affected human physiology in unpredictable ways. A few more perceptive observers suggested that the problems might be related to psychic phenomena, but this explanation was rejected by most authorities as inconsistent with the Imperial Truth's rational worldview. The Emperor himself was aware of these developments, but his interpretation of their significance differed dramatically from that of his subordinates. His superior understanding of the warp and its inhabitants allowed him to recognize the true nature of the corruption that was beginning to affect his forces. He knew that the Chaos Gods were attempting to subvert his grand design, and he understood that their influence was growing stronger as the Great Crusade expanded human presence across the galaxy. However, the Emperor's response to this recognition revealed one of the fundamental flaws in his approach to leadership. Rather than sharing his knowledge with his sons and subordinates, he chose to handle the problem through increased secrecy and isolation. He withdrew from direct participation in Crusade operations to focus on what he claimed was a more important project, one that would protect humanity from the very threats that were beginning to manifest among his forces. This withdrawal had devastating consequences for the morale and psychological stability of the Primarchs. They had always struggled with their father's emotional distance, but his apparent abandonment of the Crusade at its moment of greatest triumph left them feeling confused and abandoned. Their requests for explanation were met with vague references to the greater good and the long-term survival of humanity, but no concrete information about the nature of the threats he was working to counter. The clues to the underlying causes of the growing corruption were scattered throughout Imperial records, but they required a level of understanding about the nature of the warp that few possessed. Compliance campaigns in regions with high concentrations of psychers took longer and required more resources than expected. Worlds that had been isolated during the Age of Strife often displayed cultural practices and religious beliefs that seemed to have evolved independently but shared disturbing similarities with practices known to be associated with warp corruption. Most ominously, the rate of psychic awakening among human populations continued to accelerate despite the Imperial Truth's emphasis on rational thought and scientific understanding. The Emperor had hoped that education and cultural transformation would reduce the incidence of psychic phenomena, but the opposite seemed to be occurring. More humans were developing psychic abilities, and those abilities were becoming stronger and more difficult to control. The Primarch, most affected by these developments, was Magnus the Red, whose psychic abilities and intellectual curiosity made him uniquely qualified to understand what was happening. His private researches had revealed the existence of entities in the warp that clearly contradicted the Imperial Truth's denial of supernatural phenomena. His attempts to warn his father about these discoveries were met with stern warnings to cease his investigations and focus on his military duties. This rejection of Magnus's concerns represented a crucial failure of communication that would have catastrophic consequences for the future of the Imperium. The Emperor possessed the knowledge and understanding necessary to explain the true nature of the threats facing humanity, but his commitment to maintaining the secrecy of that knowledge prevented him from providing his sons with the information they needed to recognize and resist corruption. The psychological impact of this secrecy was particularly devastating for Primarchs like Lorgar, who had always sought deeper meaning and purpose beyond mere military conquest. His repeated attempts to establish spiritual practices within the Imperium had been rejected by the Emperor, but the growing evidence of supernatural forces operating beyond the boundaries of Imperial science suggested that his instincts about the need for spiritual guidance had been correct all along. The corruption that was beginning to affect the legions was not random or accidental. It represented a carefully orchestrated campaign by the Chaos Gods to exploit the psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that the Imperial Truth had created rather than addressed. By denying the existence of supernatural forces, the Emperor had left his followers unprepared to recognize and resist their influence. By maintaining strict secrecy about the true nature of these threats, he had prevented the development of effective countermeasures that might have protected his forces from corruption. As the Great Crusade entered its final phase, the signs of corruption were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore or explain away. The Emperor's grand design was being undermined not by external enemies or military defeats, but by the very success of his expansion across the galaxy. Each new world brought humanity into contact with forces and influences that tested the limits of the Imperial Truth's protective power. Each new victory created new opportunities for corruption to spread among the forces that had achieved it. The stage was being set for a confrontation between the Emperor's vision of rational human supremacy and forces that operated according to principles that transcended rational understanding. The first signs of corruption had appeared among his most trusted and capable servants, suggesting that the coming crisis would strike at the very heart of his empire. The question was no longer whether corruption would spread, but whether the Emperor would recognize the true scope of the threat in time to prevent the complete collapse of everything he had built. The nature of the threat that began to manifest during the latter years of the Great Crusade was unlike anything the Imperium had previously encountered. Where alien enemies could be understood in terms of territory, resources, and military capability, this new adversary operated according to principles that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Imperial civilization had been built. The Chaos Gods were not merely powerful entities seeking conquest or destruction, but forces of nature that fed on the very emotions and beliefs that made humanity what it was. What made the Chaos threat so insidious was its ability to corrupt from within rather than attack from without. The ruinous powers had learned that direct confrontation with the Emperor's forces was futile, given the overwhelming military superiority of the Space Marine legions and the technological advantages of Imperial civilization. Instead, they began to work through the psychological and spiritual vulnerabilities that the Imperial Truth had inadvertently created, turning the Emperor's greatest achievements into weapons that could be used against him. The first major confrontations with Chaos-influenced forces occurred during compliance campaigns in regions that had been isolated during the Age of Strife. These worlds had developed in ways that reflected the growing influence of the warp on human civilization, their populations having evolved cultural practices and belief systems that seemed primitive and superstitious to Imperial observers, but were actually sophisticated methods of channeling and controlling psychic energy. The compliance of Davin marked a crucial turning point in the Imperium's understanding of the threats it faced. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward campaign against a techno-barbarian civilization revealed itself to be something far more complex and dangerous. The planet's warrior lodges possessed weapons and knowledge that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics, and their leaders demonstrated abilities that could only be explained by direct manipulation of warp energy. The Space Marine Legion's response to these phenomena revealed the extent to which the Imperial Truth had left them unprepared for supernatural threats. Their tactical doctrines, weapons, and training had been designed to defeat enemies that operated according to rational principles and physical laws. When confronted with opponents who could manipulate reality itself through force of will and emotion, many Imperial forces found themselves at a severe disadvantage despite their technological and numerical superiority. The psychological impact of these encounters was even more devastating than their military consequences. Space Marines who had been conditioned to believe that the universe operated according to scientific principles found themselves facing evidence that directly contradicted everything they had been taught. Some responded with denial, refusing to accept that what they were witnessing was real. Others attempted to find rational explanations for irrational phenomena, creating elaborate theories that became increasingly divorced from observable reality. Most troubling of all were those who began to embrace the supernatural forces they encountered, viewing them as tools that could be used to achieve Imperial objectives more effectively than conventional weapons and tactics. These individuals often rationalized their corruption by arguing that they were simply employing superior technology that happened to operate according to principles that Imperial science had not yet understood. The escalating conflict between Imperial forces and Chaos-influenced civilizations began to reveal patterns that suggested the presence of a coordinating intelligence behind what had initially appeared to be isolated incidents. Tactical approaches that had been successful against one chaos-corrupted world proved ineffective against others, as if their enemies were learning from each engagement and adapting their strategies accordingly. The desperate measures taken to maintain Crusade momentum in the face of these challenges led to the adoption of increasingly extreme tactics that began to compromise the moral foundation of imperial civilization. Entire populations were subjected to memory modification to eliminate knowledge of supernatural phenomena they had witnessed. Worlds that could not be cleansed of chaos corruption were subjected to exterminatus, their entire biospheres destroyed to prevent the spread of taint to neighboring systems. These actions were justified as necessary for the survival of humanity as a whole, but they created moral contradictions that troubled many of the Primarchs who were forced to implement them. The Emperor's vision of a rational, enlightened civilization seemed increasingly incompatible with the brutal realities of fighting an enemy that could corrupt the very foundations of human nature. The Emperor's increasing focus on his secret project in the Imperial Palace dungeons began to take on new significance, as reports of supernatural phenomena multiplied across the galaxy. His public statements continued to deny the existence of supernatural forces, but his private actions suggested a being who was acutely aware of threats that transcended conventional understanding. The vast resources being devoted to his mysterious work were desperately needed for the Crusade, yet he insisted that his project took precedence over all other imperial activities. The growing evidence of the ruinous power's direct influence became impossible to ignore when entire Space Marine units began to exhibit behaviors that could only be explained by external corruption. The transformation was not gradual or subtle, but sudden and dramatic, as if a switch had been thrown that changed their fundamental nature overnight. Warriors who had served with distinction for centuries suddenly turned on their comrades, displaying abilities and knowledge that they could not possibly have acquired through normal means. The investigation of these incidents revealed that the corruption often followed patterns that suggested deliberate targeting by entities with detailed knowledge of imperial organization and psychology. The most effective and charismatic leaders were often the first to be corrupted, their influence then being used to spread the taint to their subordinates. The corruption seemed to be designed not just to neutralize imperial forces but to turn them into weapons that could be used against the Imperium itself. The Primarchs' reactions to these developments varied dramatically depending on their individual personalities and philosophical orientations. Some, like Dorn and Guilliman, responded by implementing increasingly strict security measures and loyalty verification procedures. Others, like Khan and Korax, adopted more flexible approaches that emphasized rapid response and tactical adaptation. A few, like Magnus and Lorgar, began to question whether the Emperor's refusal to acknowledge supernatural forces was ultimately counterproductive. The most dangerous response came from those Primarchs who began to believe that the only way to defeat chaos was to understand and use its own methods against it. This line of thinking was particularly attractive to warriors who had built their reputations on their ability to overcome any enemy through superior skill and determination. The idea that there might be foes that could not be defeated through conventional means was fundamentally incompatible with their self-image and understanding of their role in the universe. The Emperor's recognition of the true scope of the threat facing humanity led to a series of decisions that would ultimately prove catastrophic for the unity of the Imperium. His withdrawal from active leadership of the Crusade was intended to allow him to focus on developing countermeasures against chaos corruption, but it created a power vacuum that the ruinous powers were perfectly positioned to exploit. The appointment of Horus as War Master was meant to address this problem by providing the Crusade with unified leadership in the Emperor's absence. However, this decision inadvertently created the conditions for the greatest betrayal in human history. By concentrating so much authority in a single individual, the Emperor had created a single point of failure that the Chaos Gods could target with all their considerable resources and cunning. The Chaos Powers strategy during this period revealed a sophistication and long-term planning capability that exceeded anything the Imperium had previously encountered. They had spent centuries studying the Emperor's methods and psychology, identifying the specific weaknesses that could be exploited to bring down his grand design. Their corruption of the Primarchs was not random or opportunistic, but carefully targeted to maximize the damage that would result from each individual's fall. The rising threat of chaos corruption represented more than just a military challenge to imperial expansion. It was a fundamental assault on the philosophical foundations of human civilization that called into question everything the Emperor had sought to achieve. The imperial truth's emphasis on rationality and denial of supernatural forces had created a civilization that was uniquely vulnerable to enemies that operated outside the boundaries of rational understanding. As the Great Crusade entered its final phase, It became clear that the conflict between the Imperium and the forces of chaos was not merely a war for territory or resources, but a battle for the very soul of humanity. The outcome would determine not just who controlled the galaxy, but what kind of species humanity would become in the millennia to come. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every aspect of the Emperor's vision and reveal whether his dream of human supremacy could survive contact with forces that transcended human understanding. The rising threat had revealed the Emperor's greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. His superior knowledge of the warp and its inhabitants gave him insights that no other being possessed, but his refusal to share that knowledge with his followers had left them vulnerable to corruption and manipulation. The very secrecy that he believed was necessary to protect humanity from chaos was creating the conditions that would allow chaos to achieve its greatest victory. The Emperor's withdrawal from the Great Crusade to pursue his secret project represented a fundamental shift in Imperial strategy that would have consequences far beyond anything his followers could have imagined. What the Primarchs and the broader Imperial hierarchy understood as an abandonment of the Crusade at its moment of greatest triumph was actually a desperate race against time to develop countermeasures against threats that could destroy humanity entirely. The project that consumed the Emperor's attention during the final years of the Great Crusade was nothing less than an attempt to revolutionize human civilization's relationship with the warp itself. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, vast chambers had been excavated to house machinery and experiments that operated according to principles that even the Mechanicum's greatest tech priests could not fully comprehend. The Emperor was attempting to create a human version of the Eldar Webway, a network of tunnels through the warp that would allow instantaneous travel between distant points in the galaxy without exposure to the corrupting influence of chaos. The technological and psychic challenges involved in this undertaking were staggering in their complexity. The Webway was not simply a collection of tunnels carved through the warp, but a sophisticated matrix of psychic barriers and dimensional manipulations that required constant maintenance by beings with capabilities that exceeded even those of the most powerful human psykers. The Emperor's attempt to replicate this achievement using human science and psychic ability represented an unprecedented fusion of technologies that had never been attempted before. The abandoned principles and discarded safeguards that characterized this phase of the Emperor's work reflected the desperate urgency of his situation. Previous Imperial projects had always been conducted with elaborate safety protocols and extensive testing procedures designed to minimize the risk of catastrophic failure. The Webway project, however, was being pursued with a recklessness that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The scale of resources being devoted to this secret undertaking was enormous, drawing materials and personnel from across the Imperium in ways that began to strain the logistics of the Great Crusade itself. Entire forge worlds were retasked to produce components for machinery whose purpose was known only to the Emperor and his closest advisors. Thousands of the most powerful psykers in Imperial service were secretly transported to Terra to participate in experiments that many of them did not survive. The dangerous experiments being conducted beneath the Imperial Palace involved technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe or sane by conventional Imperial standards. The Emperor was not merely attempting to create new tools, but to fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself in ways that could have unpredictable consequences for the entire galaxy. The psychic energies involved in these experiments were so vast that they created distortions in local space-time that could be detected by sensitive instruments across entire star systems. The unintended consequences of these experiments began to manifest almost immediately, though their full significance would not become apparent until much later. The psychic disturbances created by the Webway project began to attract the attention of entities in the warp that had previously shown little interest in human affairs. The barrier between the material universe and the realm of chaos began to weaken in the vicinity of Terra, creating opportunities for corruption and influence that had not existed before. Most critically, the Emperor's total focus on his secret project created a point of no return moment when he became psychically bound to the machinery he was creating. The Webway portals he was attempting to construct required a constant flow of psychic energy to maintain their stability, and the Emperor had made himself the primary source of that energy. This decision meant that he could not abandon the project without risking catastrophic collapse of the barriers he had created, potentially opening a permanent gateway for chaos forces to invade the heart of the Imperium. The growing distance between the Emperor and his sons during this period was not merely physical but psychological and emotional as well. The Primarchs had always struggled with their father's emotional unavailability, but his apparent abandonment of them at the moment of their greatest triumph created wounds that would never fully heal. Their requests for explanation and guidance were met with increasingly brusque dismissals as the Emperor's attention became entirely consumed by his work. The psychological impact of this abandonment was particularly devastating for Primarchs like Horus, who had built their entire identity around their relationship with their father and their role in his grand design. The appointment of Horus as War Master was intended to compensate for the Emperor's absence, but it actually made the situation worse by creating expectations and responsibilities that no single being could fulfill while simultaneously highlighting the Emperor's withdrawal from direct involvement in his sons' lives. The delegation of authority that accompanied the Emperor's withdrawal created opportunities for corruption that the Chaos Gods were perfectly positioned to exploit. By concentrating so much power in the hands of individuals who lacked the Emperor's knowledge and understanding of supernatural threats, the imperial hierarchy became vulnerable to manipulation and subversion in ways that had not existed when the Emperor was directly involved in day-to-day operations. The backfiring of the Emperor's innovations became apparent when his attempts to protect humanity from chaos corruption actually created new vulnerabilities that could be exploited by his enemies. The psychic disturbances created by the Webway project made Terra itself a target for chaos influence, while the secrecy surrounding the project prevented the development of adequate security measures to protect against supernatural threats. The point of no return moment came when the Emperor realized that his withdrawal from the Crusade had created conditions that were allowing chaos corruption to spread among his most trusted servants. His sons were beginning to show signs of the very corruption he had been working to prevent. But his commitment to the Webway project meant that he could not abandon his work to address these problems directly. He was trapped in a situation where success in one area required acceptance of failure in another. The Emperor's recognition of this dilemma led to increasingly desperate attempts to manage both crises simultaneously. He began to rely more heavily on remote psychic influence to guide and protect his sons. But this approach proved inadequate to counter the sophisticated corruption campaigns being waged by the Chaos Gods. His psychic interventions were often misinterpreted or resented by the Primarchs, who saw them as further evidence of their father's emotional distance and lack of trust. The solutions the Emperor attempted to implement during this period often created worse problems than the ones they were meant to solve. His efforts to maintain secrecy about the Webway project prevented him from explaining to his sons why their concerns and requests for guidance were being ignored. His attempts to accelerate the project's completion led to increasingly dangerous experiments that weakened the barriers between reality and the warp. His delegation of authority to subordinates created opportunities for corruption that he was too distracted to monitor or prevent. The crossing of the point of no return occurred when the Emperor's attempts to perfect his Webway technology resulted in a catastrophic breach that allowed chaos forces to invade the very heart of his stronghold. The demonic incursion that erupted beneath the Imperial Palace required his constant attention to contain, making it impossible for him to address the growing crisis among his sons. He had become a prisoner of his own creation, bound to the machinery that was supposed to liberate humanity, but instead had made him a slave to its requirements. The innovations that the Emperor had hoped would secure humanity's future had instead created the conditions for its greatest catastrophe. His withdrawal from active leadership had allowed corruption to spread among his most trusted servants. His secret experiments had weakened the barriers that protected Terra from chaos invasion. His emotional distance from his sons had created the psychological vulnerabilities that the ruinous powers needed to turn his greatest achievements against him. The desperate measures that had seemed necessary to protect humanity from external threats had instead created internal vulnerabilities that proved far more dangerous than anything the Imperium had previously faced. The Emperor's vision of a rational scientific civilization had led him to pursue technological solutions to problems that required personal relationships and emotional understanding to resolve. His greatest strength, his superior knowledge and understanding of the universe's fundamental nature, had become his greatest weakness when it prevented him from sharing that knowledge with the people who needed it most. As the Emperor became increasingly trapped by the requirements of his secret project, the stage was being set for the greatest betrayal in human history. His sons, feeling abandoned and confused by their father's apparent rejection, were becoming vulnerable to influences that promised them the understanding and purpose that he had failed to provide. The very innovations that were supposed to secure humanity's future were creating the conditions that would lead to its near destruction. The corruption of Horus Lupercal, the emperor's most favored son and the appointed war master of the Great Crusade, did not occur as a sudden transformation, but as the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been developing for decades. The Chaos Gods had recognized that the direct approach to destroying the Emperor's grand design had failed, and they had instead chosen to target the one individual whose fall would cause maximum damage to the unity and effectiveness of Imperial forces. The origins of Horus's internal threat development can be traced to the growing psychological pressure created by his appointment as War Master, combined with his father's increasing emotional distance. The Emperor had elevated Horus above his brothers, not because he loved him more, but because his particular combination of charisma, strategic brilliance, and political acumen made him the most effective choice for coordinating the vast complexity of the Great Crusade. However, Horus interpreted this appointment through the lens of his desperate need for his father's approval and recognition. The burden of commanding the Great Crusade in the Emperor's absence proved to be far greater than even Horus's considerable capabilities could manage effectively. He found himself responsible for coordinating the actions of 18 other Primarchs, each with their own personalities, philosophies, and approaches to warfare. The political complexities of managing compliance campaigns across hundreds of worlds simultaneously required diplomatic skills that exceeded even his considerable talents. More damaging still was the gradual realization that his appointment as War Master had not brought him closer to his father, but had actually increased the distance between them. The Emperor's withdrawal to pursue his secret project meant that their communications became increasingly formal and infrequent. Horus's requests for guidance and explanation were met with instructions to handle matters independently, leaving him feeling abandoned at the moment when he most needed support and understanding. The turning point when the War Master began his transformation into the arch-traitor occurred during the campaign on Davin, where Horus was wounded by a weapon that had been corrupted by chaos influence. The injury itself was not fatal, but it provided the opportunity for chaos forces to make direct contact with his consciousness while he lay unconscious and vulnerable. The visions and experiences he encountered during this period were carefully crafted to exploit his deepest fears and resentments. The Chaos Gods did not approach Horus with crude offers of power or obviously corrupting temptations. Instead, they presented themselves as concerned allies who shared his frustrations with the Emperor's secretive behavior and emotional distance. They revealed selected truths about the Emperor's nature and intentions, truths that were accurate but presented in ways that cast the Emperor's actions in the most negative possible light. The spreading corruption through the Luna Wolves Legion, and eventually through half of the Space Marine legions, represented a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that exploited the very loyalty and brotherhood that had made the legions so effective. Horus did not simply order his subordinates to rebel against the Emperor, but gradually convinced them that the Emperor had betrayed the ideals of the Great Crusade, and that true loyalty required opposition to his current course of action. The process of corruption was facilitated by the warrior lodges that had developed within many legions as informal organizations for promoting brotherhood and mutual support among Space Marines. These lodges provided ready-made networks for spreading Horus's reinterpretation of recent events and his growing conviction that the Emperor had abandoned his sons in pursuit of godhood for himself. The Emperor's final realization of the heresy's scope came not through Imperial intelligence networks or warning signs from his loyal sons, but through his own psychic abilities as the corruption reached levels that could no longer be hidden. The shock of discovering that his most beloved son had turned against him was devastating, not just emotionally but strategically, as it meant that half of his military forces were now effectively under enemy control. The trusted War Master's transformation into an enemy represented a failure of the Emperor's understanding of human nature that was far more fundamental than a simple miscalculation about Horus's loyalty. The Emperor had created the Primarchs to be perfect instruments of his will, but he had failed to account for their emotional needs as sentient beings who required love, understanding, and purpose beyond mere obedience to achieve psychological stability. The most devastating aspect of the betrayal was not the military threat it posed, but the way it challenged the Emperor's fundamental beliefs about the nature of leadership and the relationship between authority and consent. He had assumed that superior knowledge and capability automatically conferred the right to rule, but Horus's rebellion demonstrated that even superhuman beings required emotional connection and shared understanding to maintain their loyalty. The role of Magnus the Red in the destruction of the Webway project represented a separate but related tragedy that compounded the disaster of Horus's betrayal. Magnus had discovered the growing corruption among his brothers, and had attempted to warn the Emperor using his considerable psychic abilities to penetrate the barriers surrounding the imperial palace. His intentions were entirely loyal and his concern for his father's safety was genuine, but his psychic message shattered the carefully constructed barriers that contained the Webway project. The Emperor's rage at Magnus's well-intentioned action revealed the enormous psychological strain he was under as multiple crises converged simultaneously. The destruction of his life's work, combined with the realization that another of his sons had seemingly betrayed him through disobedience, led to a display of fury that was unprecedented in imperial history. His order for the burning of Prospero and the destruction of Magnus's legion was a reaction driven more by emotional devastation than strategic calculation. The challenge to the Emperor's fundamental beliefs through Magnus's perceived betrayal was particularly painful because it involved a son who had always shared his intellectual interests and scientific curiosity. Magnus's pursuit of psychic knowledge had always troubled the Emperor, but it had also reminded him of his own younger self. The discovery that this pursuit had led to the destruction of the Webway project felt like a betrayal not just of his trust but of the rational principles that supposedly governed their relationship. The full scale of the heresy's deception became apparent as reports began to reach Terra of Space Marine legions turning against Imperial forces across the galaxy. The rebellion was not limited to Horus and his immediate followers, but included Primarchs and legions that had previously shown no signs of corruption or disloyalty. The coordination and simultaneity of these betrayals revealed a level of planning and organization that suggested the involvement of intelligence far superior to anything possessed by human rebels. The Emperor's response to the revelation of the heresy's true scope demonstrated both his greatest strengths and his most dangerous limitations as a leader. His strategic genius allowed him to immediately understand the implications of the situation and begin planning defensive measures that would maximize the Imperium's chances of survival. However, his emotional devastation at the betrayal of his sons led to decisions that were driven more by personal pain than strategic necessity. The realization that he had failed not just as a military commander, but as a father created psychological wounds that would never fully heal. The Emperor had always prided himself on his superior understanding of human nature, but the rebellion of his sons revealed that his knowledge was incomplete, and his assumptions were flawed. He had created beings capable of superhuman achievement, but had failed to provide them with the emotional support they needed to remain stable and loyal. The broader implications of the betrayal extended far beyond the immediate military threat posed by the rebel legions. The heresy represented a fundamental challenge to the philosophical foundations of imperial civilization, calling into question the basic assumptions about authority, loyalty, and the relationship between ruler and ruled that had governed human society since the beginning of the Great Crusade. The Emperor's vision of a rational, enlightened civilization had assumed that superior beings would naturally command the loyalty and obedience of their inferiors. The rebellion of the Primarchs demonstrated that even superhuman beings required emotional connection and shared purpose to maintain their allegiance. The cold, distant efficiency that had characterized the Emperor's leadership style was revealed to be not a strength but a critical weakness that had created the conditions for the greatest catastrophe in human history. As news of the heresy spread across the galaxy, the carefully constructed unity of the Imperium began to collapse into civil war and chaos. The Great Crusade, which had been on the verge of achieving total victory over humanity's enemies, was transformed overnight into a desperate struggle for survival against forces that possessed intimate knowledge of imperial capabilities and weaknesses. The golden age of human expansion was ending, and the grim darkness of perpetual warfare was beginning. The infrastructure breakdown that followed the revelation of the Horus Heresy was not merely a matter of military units changing sides, but a systematic collapse of the administrative, logistical, and communication networks that had made the Great Crusade possible. The Imperium had been designed as a centralized system that relied on absolute loyalty and shared purpose to coordinate activities across 1,000,000 worlds. When that loyalty and purpose were compromised, the entire structure began to fail in ways that compounded exponentially. The immediate effects of the rebellion were most visible in the breakdown of supply lines and communication networks that connected the far-flung regions of imperial space. Forge worlds that had been producing weapons and equipment for loyal forces found themselves cut off from their destinations or worse, discovered that their products were being diverted to supply rebel armies. Space Marine legions that had operated as unified forces for over 2 centuries suddenly found themselves split into factions that viewed each other as enemies rather than brothers. The Emperor's retreat from the Webway Project defense represented one of the most difficult decisions of his entire existence. For decades, he had devoted every moment of his consciousness to maintaining the psychic barriers that prevented demonic forces from pouring through the breach created by Magnus's psychic message. Abandoning this vigil meant accepting that the heart of his empire would be permanently contaminated by chaos influence. But the alternative was to allow the rebellion to succeed while he remained trapped beneath the Imperial Palace. The Daemon incursion that erupted from the damaged Webway tunnels created a supernatural battlefield beneath the Imperial Palace that required constant attention from the Emperor's most elite forces. The Custodian Guard, who had been designed to protect the Emperor from any conceivable threat, found themselves fighting an enemy that defied every tactical doctrine and strategic principle they had ever learned. Daemons did not die when their bodies were destroyed, did not retreat when faced with superior firepower, and did not operate according to any rational military logic. Imperial unity dissolving into civil war created psychological trauma that extended far beyond the immediate participants in the conflict. Space Marines who had been created to serve as humanity's protectors found themselves forced to choose between loyalty to their Primarch fathers and loyalty to the Emperor who had created them. Many chose to follow their genetic progenitors into rebellion, but others remained loyal to the Emperor despite the emotional agony of opposing their own brothers. The breakdown of communication networks meant that many Imperial forces learned of the heresy only when they were attacked by forces they had previously considered allies. The shock and confusion created by these surprise attacks often proved more devastating than the military damage they inflicted. Units that might have been able to organize effective resistance if they had been given time to prepare were instead destroyed before they could understand what was happening to them. The Emperor's final desperate attempts to salvage the situation revealed the extent to which he had become isolated from the practical realities of governing a galactic empire. His orders to loyal forces often failed to account for local conditions or resource limitations that would have been obvious to commanders with direct experience of the situation. His strategic directives, while brilliant in conception, often proved impossible to implement given the breakdown of the infrastructure needed to coordinate large-scale military operations. The loss of key worlds during the early phases of the Civil War created a domino effect that made each subsequent loss more devastating than the last. The heresy had not struck randomly, but had targeted the most strategically important worlds and installations in the Imperium. Forge worlds that produced specialized equipment, agricultural worlds that fed entire sectors, and communication hubs that coordinated interstellar commerce all became battlegrounds that neither side could afford to lose. The approach of Horus's forces to Terra represented more than just a military threat to the Imperial capital. It was a psychological assault on the very concept of Imperial authority and the Emperor's claim to rule humanity. The sight of the War Master's fleet in orbit around humanity's homeworld sent a message to every Imperial citizen that the Emperor's power was not absolute and his protection was not guaranteed. The Emperor's psychological transformation from father to war leader during this period was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire catastrophe. The being who had once spoken of elevating humanity to godlike status was forced to make decisions that required him to sacrifice millions of his own followers to prevent even greater losses. The cold, calculating efficiency that had always characterized his leadership style became a desperate ruthlessness that accepted any cost to achieve strategic objectives. The effects of the cascading collapse made the situation exponentially worse, as each system failure created new problems that stressed other systems beyond their breaking points. The loss of Forge worlds reduced the production of weapons and equipment needed by loyal forces. The breakdown of communication networks prevented effective coordination between distant Imperial armies. The corruption of Space Marine legions eliminated the elite forces that had been expected to serve as the backbone of Imperial resistance. The rapid loss of long-held positions that had seemed secure for centuries created a sense of helplessness and despair among Imperial forces that proved almost as damaging as actual military defeats. Strongholds that had withstood siege for decades fell to rebel forces in a matter of days. Ancient treaties and alliances that had endured for millennia were dissolved overnight as local rulers chose pragmatic accommodation with the rebels over potentially suicidal loyalty to a distant emperor. The survivors of the loyalist forces found themselves faced with choices that would determine not just their own fate, but the ultimate outcome of the Civil War. Some chose to retreat to defensive positions where they could hold out against rebel attacks while hoping for reinforcement that might never come. Others decided to launch desperate counterattacks against rebel positions, accepting almost certain death in exchange for the possibility of inflicting significant damage on their enemies. The most difficult choice facing loyalist commanders was whether to accept civilian casualties in order to deny resources to rebel forces. The scorched earth tactics that became increasingly common during the later phases of the heresy required imperial forces to destroy infrastructure and populations that they had spent centuries building and protecting. The moral agony of these decisions created psychological wounds that would never heal, even among those who survived the conflict. The Emperor's recognition that the heresy represented an existential threat to humanity's survival led to increasingly extreme measures that would have been unthinkable during the hopeful days of the Great Crusade. Entire worlds were subjected to exterminators to prevent them from falling into rebel hands. Civilian populations were forcibly conscripted into military service regardless of their age or physical condition. Ancient weapons and technologies that had been forbidden due to their dangerous nature were deployed without regard for their long-term consequences. The cascade of failures that characterized this period of the Civil War revealed fundamental weaknesses in the Emperor's grand design that went far beyond simple tactical or strategic miscalculations. The Imperium had been built on the assumption that superior beings would naturally command the loyalty and obedience of their inferiors, but the rebellion of the Primarchs demonstrated that even superhuman beings required emotional connection and shared understanding to maintain their allegiance. The breakdown of the carefully constructed system that had governed human civilization for over 2 centuries created opportunities for older, more primitive forms of organization to reassert themselves. Tribal loyalties, religious movements, and local warlords began to fill the power vacuum created by the collapse of imperial authority. Many of these movements were actively hostile to imperial values and objectives, while others simply ignored the larger conflict in favor of pursuing their own immediate interests. As the Civil War entered its most desperate phase, the Emperor was forced to confront the possibility that his vision of human supremacy might not survive the catastrophe that his own decisions had helped to create. The golden age of expansion and achievement was ending, and the future that awaited humanity was one of perpetual warfare, religious fanaticism, and technological stagnation. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether any remnant of his dream could be preserved for future generations. The build-up to the final confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, represented the culmination of a conflict that had consumed the galaxy for 7 years and transformed the Emperor's greatest triumph into humanity's darkest hour. The siege of Terra had reached its climactic phase, with the walls of the Imperial Palace breached and traitor forces advancing through the very heart of the Emperor's domain. The decision to board the War Master's vessel was not born of strategic calculation, but of the desperate recognition that conventional warfare had failed, and only a direct confrontation between father and son could determine the outcome of the Civil War. The Emperor's choice to teleport directly to Horus's flagship was influenced by reports that the War Master had lowered his ship's void shields, apparently an invitation for just such an encounter. Intelligence suggested that this was either a trap designed to eliminate the Emperor and his remaining loyal Primarchs in a single stroke, or evidence that some remnant of the real Horus remained beneath the chaos corruption and sought a final meeting with his father. Neither possibility offered much hope for success, but the alternative was to watch the Imperium die slowly as traitor forces ground down the last loyalist resistance. The Emperor was accompanied by 2 of his most trusted sons, Rogaldorn and Sanguinius, along with a contingent of his finest custodian guards and Imperial Fists Terminators. The decision to bring such a small force reflected both the limitations imposed by teleportation technology and the recognition that this confrontation would ultimately be decided by the personal conflict between the Emperor and his fallen son, rather than by conventional military action. The detailed account of the climactic conflict that followed has been preserved in fragments scattered across Imperial records, though many details remain classified or have been altered by later propaganda efforts. What is known with certainty is that the battle progressed through several distinct phases, each representing a different aspect of the larger conflict between the forces of order and chaos that had torn the galaxy apart. The initial phase of the confrontation took place in the corridors and chambers of the Vengeful Spirit, as the Emperor's small force fought their way toward the bridge where Horus waited. The ship itself had been transformed by years of chaos corruption into something that was more daemon engine than conventional starship. The walls bled. The air itself seemed alive with malevolent intelligence, and the very geometry of the interior spaces defied rational understanding. Sanguinius reached Horus first, and their battle became the stuff of legend even as it was occurring. The Angel and the War Master had once been as close as biological brothers could be. Their relationship founded on mutual respect and genuine affection that had survived the early stages of the heresy. But the being that faced Sanguinius was no longer truly Horus, but a vessel for powers that sought the complete destruction of everything the Emperor had built. The death of Sanguinius marked the point at which the conflict transcended conventional warfare and became something approaching mythic significance. The most beloved of all the Primarchs died, not through military defeat, but through a deliberate choice to sacrifice himself in an attempt to weaken the chaos powers that were controlling his brother. His final act was not an attack but an embrace, a gesture of love and forgiveness that momentarily caused the real Horus to reassert himself beneath the corruption. The Emperor's arrival at the scene of his son's death triggered the final phase of the confrontation, a battle that was fought simultaneously on the physical, psychic, and spiritual planes of existence. The being that faced him wore Horus's face and possessed his memories, but was animated by powers that represented everything the Emperor had spent his existence fighting against. This was not merely a conflict between father and son, but a battle for the future of human consciousness itself. The key turning points that decided the outcome of the battle reflected the fundamental contradictions that had always existed within the Emperor's relationship with his sons. His initial restraint in the face of Horus's attacks was born not of tactical consideration, but of emotional attachment to the son he had loved above all others. Even corrupted beyond recognition, even actively seeking to destroy everything the Emperor held dear, Horus remained his child, and the Emperor found himself unable to strike with the full force necessary to end the threat he represented. This restraint nearly proved fatal, as Horus's near victory demonstrated the true scope of the power that Chaos had invested in their chosen champion. Enhanced by the combined might of all four Chaos gods, Horus possessed capabilities that rivaled or exceeded even the Emperor's own. His attacks were not merely physical or psychic, but struck at the fundamental structure of reality itself, threatening not just the Emperor's life, but his very existence as a conscious entity. The moment that changed everything came through the intervention of Alanius Pius, a simple imperial guardsman who had somehow made his way to the bridge during the chaos of the battle. His attempt to protect the Emperor from Horus's final assault was doomed from the start, but his courage in the face of overwhelming odds served a purpose that transcended military significance. The casual cruelty with which Horus destroyed this defenseless human being finally revealed to the Emperor that nothing remained of his son beneath the chaos corruption. The Emperor's realization that he must kill his son represented the most devastating moment of his existence, a psychological blow that would echo through the 10,000 years that followed. The being who had created the Primarchs as the ultimate expression of human potential was forced to destroy one of them, to prevent the complete destruction of the species he had sought to elevate. The emotional agony of this decision was so profound that it fundamentally altered his relationship with power and authority, transforming him from a proud conqueror into a martyred protector. The final moments of the battle were decided not by superior strategy or overwhelming force, but by the Emperor's willingness to sacrifice everything, including his own life, to ensure that the threat Horus represented could never arise again. His psychic assault on the War Master was designed not merely to kill his physical form, but to completely obliterate his soul, ensuring that the Chaos Gods could never resurrect him or use his essence for future corruption. The victory came at a cost that was almost beyond comprehension. The Emperor's mortal form was shattered by the forces he had unleashed, his body broken in ways that even his superhuman constitution could not repair. More devastating still was the psychic damage inflicted by the necessity of destroying his most beloved son. Wounds to his consciousness that would never heal, and would forever alter his relationship with the remaining loyal Primarchs. Horus's death marked the end of the War Master as a coherent entity, but it did not end the threat he had represented. The Chaos powers that had invested so much in his corruption were not destroyed by his defeat, merely denied their most effective instrument. The civil war would continue for years after the battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit, but the death of the arch-traitor removed the unifying force that had held the rebellion together. The Emperor's mortal wounding and psychological devastation represented a transformation that went far beyond mere physical injury. The being who had once stridden across the galaxy as humanity's undisputed master was reduced to a dying shell whose consciousness was focused entirely on maintaining the psychic barriers that kept chaos from consuming the species he had sought to protect. His dreams of elevation and transcendence were replaced by the grim necessity of eternal vigilance against forces that would never cease their attempts to corrupt and destroy. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw the Emperor's broken form transported back to Terra, where the most advanced medical and psychic techniques available were employed in a desperate attempt to preserve his life. The Golden Throne, originally designed as a control mechanism for the Webway project, was hastily converted into a life support system that could maintain his physical form while allowing his consciousness to continue the psychic warfare that his victory over Horus had made necessary. The final moments of the confrontation that would echo through 10,000 years established the template for everything that would follow. The Emperor's victory was also his defeat, his triumph also his doom. He had saved humanity from chaos corruption, but only by accepting a fate that was in many ways worse than death. He had become the eternal guardian of a species that would worship him as a god, while he remained powerless to guide or protect them in any way beyond his psychic vigilance against the forces of the warp. The battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit represented the end of one age and the beginning of another. The transformation of the Emperor from an active force for human advancement into a passive symbol of sacrifice and endurance. The golden age of the Great Crusade was over, and the grim darkness of the far future was beginning. The Emperor's greatest victory had become humanity's greatest tragedy, and the echoes of that final confrontation would shape the destiny of the species for millennia to come. The confusion and disorder that followed the Emperor's entombment upon the Golden Throne created a crisis of leadership that threatened to complete the destruction that the Horus Heresy had begun. For the first time in over 2 centuries, humanity found itself without the guiding presence of the being who had shaped every aspect of their civilization. The transition from the age of the Emperor's direct rule to the era of imperial institutions was chaotic, traumatic, and ultimately transformative in ways that no one could have predicted. The immediate physical consequences of the Emperor's condition were obvious to anyone who witnessed his broken form upon the Golden Throne. The being who had once radiated power and confidence was reduced to a withered corpse sustained by arcane machinery and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. His ability to communicate was severely limited, reduced to brief moments of consciousness that occurred only during times of extreme crisis. The psychological impact of this transformation on those who had served him was devastating beyond measure. How different imperial factions tried to cope with his absence revealed the fundamental weaknesses in the system the Emperor had created. The Space Marine legions, designed to function under the direct authority of their primarchs, and ultimately the Emperor himself, found themselves leaderless and directionless. Some chose to continue prosecuting the civil war against the remaining traitor forces, while others withdrew to fortress worlds where they could maintain their strength while waiting for clearer guidance that would never come. The Adeptus Mechanicus faced a particular crisis of faith, as their alliance with the Emperor had been based on their belief that he represented the Omnissiah, the physical manifestation of their machine god. His apparent death or transformation into something beyond mortal understanding challenged their fundamental theological assumptions and led to doctrinal disputes that would persist for millennia. Some tech priests declared that his entombment was merely a transition to a higher form of existence, while others suggested that the real Omnissiah had never been the Emperor at all. The struggle to fill the power vacuum left by the Emperor's incapacitation led to the establishment of the Council of Terra, later to become the High Lords of Terra, as the governing body of the Imperium. This institution was created out of necessity rather than design, bringing together representatives from the various military, religious, and administrative organizations that had previously reported directly to the Emperor. The compromises and political arrangements that made this system functional also made it inefficient and often contradictory in its policies and directives. The unexpected consequences of the Emperor's psychic presence on the throne began to manifest almost immediately, though their full significance would not become apparent for centuries. His consciousness, while focused primarily on maintaining the barriers that kept chaos forces from invading Terra, continued to exert influence over human psychers across the galaxy. Many reported visions and dreams that seemed to come from the Emperor himself, though distinguishing genuine communication from wish fulfillment or psychological projection proved impossible. The beginning of the imperial cult, despite the Emperor's rejection of godhood, represented one of the most profound transformations in human culture since the adoption of the imperial truth during the Great Crusade. The traumatic experience of the heresy had demonstrated to billions of imperial citizens that rational philosophy and scientific understanding were insufficient protection against the supernatural forces that threatened humanity's survival. The emperor's sacrifice on their behalf provided a foundation for religious devotion that no amount of official discouragement could suppress. The theological implications of this transformation were staggering in their scope and complexity. The being who had spent his entire existence fighting against superstition and religious thinking was being transformed into the central figure of humanity's largest religious movement. The irony was not lost on those who had known the emperor personally, but their attempts to discourage worship were largely futile in the face of humanity's desperate need for something to believe in. New dangers emerging during the transition period tested the Imperium's ability to survive without the emperor's direct leadership. The remaining traitor legions, while no longer unified under Horus's command, continued to pose significant threats to imperial territory. Alien races that had been held in check by the emperor's presence began to test imperial defenses, probing for weaknesses that could be exploited. Most ominously, the rate of demonic incursions and chaos corruption began to increase as the barriers between reality and the warp continued to weaken. The unexpected new problems emerging from the emperor's condition included the massive resource drain required to keep him alive. The Golden Throne required constant maintenance by the most skilled tech priests available, while the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers created logistical and moral challenges that strained imperial institutions. The black ships that collected psychers from across the galaxy had to be expanded and systematized to meet the throne's endless hunger for psychic energy. The psychological impact on the surviving Primarchs was perhaps the most immediate and visible consequence of the Emperor's entombment. These superhuman beings, created to serve as the Emperor's most trusted servants and eventual successors, found themselves orphaned in ways that their enhanced minds were not equipped to handle. Some, like Robout Guilliman, threw themselves into the work of rebuilding and organizing imperial institutions. Others, like Lemon Russ, disappeared into the galaxy on mysterious quests that may have been attempts to find some way to heal their father's wounds. The introduction of new threats to the Imperium during this vulnerable period created challenges that tested every aspect of the system the Emperor had built. The Second Founding, which broke up the remaining loyal legions into smaller chapters, was designed to prevent any single military commander from accumulating enough power to threaten Imperial unity. However, this reorganization also reduced the Imperium's ability to respond to large-scale threats that required the coordination of multiple military forces. The administrative challenges of governing a million-world empire without the Emperor's guiding presence led to the development of increasingly rigid bureaucratic systems that prioritize stability over efficiency or innovation. The flexible, adaptive approach that had characterized imperial governance during the Great Crusade was replaced by elaborate protocols and procedures that were designed to function without requiring exceptional leadership or decision-making ability. The suggestion that consequences of the Emperor's entombment were only beginning proved prophetic, as the full implications of his transformation became apparent over the following centuries. His psychic presence, while focused on protecting humanity from chaos corruption, began to have unintended effects on human evolution and development. The rate of psychic awakening among human populations continued to accelerate, creating new challenges and opportunities that imperial institutions were not prepared to handle. The emergence of the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed for safe warp travel across the galaxy, represented one of the few positive developments during this traumatic period. The Emperor's psychic presence on the Golden Throne had created a stable reference point in the chaotic environment of the warp, enabling the continuation of interstellar commerce and communication that was essential for Imperial survival. However, this achievement came at the cost of binding the Emperor even more tightly to his role as humanity's unwilling protector. The rapid succession of crises that characterized the immediate aftermath of the heresy created a siege mentality among imperial institutions that would persist for millennia. The assumption that humanity was surrounded by enemies who sought its destruction became a central tenet of imperial culture, replacing the optimistic expansionism of the Great Crusade with a defensive conservatism that viewed change and innovation as threats to be suppressed rather than opportunities to be embraced. The point where change became inevitable occurred when it became clear that the Emperor would never recover sufficiently to resume active leadership of the Imperium. The institutions that had been created as temporary measures to handle the crisis became permanent features of imperial governance. while the cultural and religious transformations that had begun during the heresy became irreversible aspects of human civilization. The immediate aftermath of the emperor's entombment established the patterns that would define imperial civilization for the next 10,000 years. The golden age of expansion and achievement was over, replaced by an era of endless warfare, religious fanaticism, and technological stagnation. The emperor's dream of human transcendence had been transformed into a nightmare of eternal vigilance against forces that would never cease their attempts to corrupt and destroy the species he had sought to elevate. The consequences that were only beginning to unfold during this period would ultimately prove more significant than the immediate crisis of leadership and governance. The emperor's transformation from active ruler to passive protector had created conditions that would shape human evolution, culture, and destiny in ways that would have been impossible to predict or prevent. The stage was set for 10 millennia of grim darkness, and the future that awaited humanity was one that would test every aspect of the civilization the emperor had built. The technological legacy of the emperor's reign continued to shape human civilization for 10,000 years after his entombment, though in ways that would have horrified the being who had originally created these marvels. The advanced sciences and rational principles that had driven the Great Crusade were gradually transformed into religious dogma and ritualistic practices that preserved the form of knowledge while abandoning its substance. The Adeptus Mechanicus, originally partners in the emperor's vision of scientific advancement, became guardians of orthodoxy who treated technology as sacred mystery rather than tool of human progress. The standard template construct systems that had enabled rapid colonization and development during the Crusade era gradually failed or were lost, taking with them the ability to mass-produce advanced technologies that had once been commonplace. Each generation of tech priests understood less about the fundamental principles governing their machines, reducing maintenance and repair to elaborate rituals whose effectiveness depended more on faith than understanding. The emperor's dream of a technologically advanced civilization was transformed into a stagnant theocracy that feared innovation as potential heresy. The cultural impact of the emperor's sacrifice and the transformation from imperial truth to imperial cult represented perhaps the most profound change in human consciousness since the development of language itself. The rational scientific worldview that had characterized the best aspects of human civilization during the dark age of technology was replaced by a religious fanaticism that viewed ignorance as virtue and questioning as sin. The species that had once reached for the stars through the power of knowledge now cowered in the darkness, praying to a god emperor who could no longer guide or protect them except through his eternal suffering. The belief changes that accompanied this cultural transformation went far beyond simple religious conversion to encompass fundamental alterations in how humans understood their place in the universe. The confident expansionism of the Great Crusade was replaced by a defensive paranoia that viewed all change as potential corruption and all outsiders as probable enemies. The optimistic humanism that had once driven human achievement was transformed into a xenophobic militarism that celebrated death in service to the emperor above life in service to human progress. The ongoing conflicts created by the heresy's aftermath became a permanent feature of imperial civilization that consumed vast resources and countless lives without ever achieving decisive resolution. The traitor legions that had fled into the Eye of Terror continued to launch raids and invasions against imperial territory, while their corruption spread to new generations of rebels and heretics who had never known the unity of the Great Crusade. The civil war that had begun as a conflict between brothers became an eternal struggle between the forces of order and chaos that would never end as long as human consciousness existed. These perpetual conflicts served multiple functions within the imperial system, providing justification for the authoritarian control exercised by imperial institutions, while channeling human aggression toward external enemies rather than internal reform. The constant state of warfare created a siege mentality that made questioning of authority appear treasonous, while the massive military expenditures required to maintain imperial defenses prevented the accumulation of resources that might have been used for technological or social advancement. Hidden survivors and remnants of the emperor's original vision continued to influence imperial development in subtle ways that were often more significant than obvious political or military events. The custodian guard, who had witnessed the emperor's sacrifice firsthand, became the keepers of his true legacy, preserving fragments of his original intentions, while carefully managing their revelation to prevent chaos or despair among imperial institutions. Their influence was rarely visible but always present, ensuring that some echo of the emperor's rational principles survived even in the darkest periods of imperial history. The scattered primarchs who had survived the heresy continued to appear at crucial moments throughout imperial history, their interventions often preventing disasters that would have destroyed the civilization their father had built. Robert Guilliman's return during the 41st millennium represented the most dramatic example of this phenomenon, his resurrection coinciding with threats that exceeded even the Imperium's considerable capacity for endurance. These appearances suggested that the Emperor's influence extended beyond his physical presence on the Golden Throne to encompass a network of agents and allies who remained committed to his ultimate objectives. The Emperor's psychic influence on humanity through the warp became increasingly significant as the millennia passed, and the barriers between reality and the immaterial realm continued to weaken. Human psychers across the galaxy reported visions and dreams that seemed to originate from the Golden Throne, though distinguishing genuine communication from psychological projection remained impossible even for the most skilled investigators. These experiences created a form of communion between the Emperor and his subjects that transcended conventional understanding of consciousness and identity. The manifestations of this psychic influence were most visible among the Imperial Saints, individuals who displayed abilities and knowledge that exceeded normal human capabilities and seemed to serve as instruments of the Emperor's will. These figures appeared throughout imperial history at moments of crisis, providing leadership and inspiration that enabled imperial forces to overcome challenges that would otherwise have proved insurmountable. Whether they represented genuine divine intervention or simply the unconscious expression of human potential remained a matter of theological debate. The gradual deification of the emperor despite his original atheistic stance created theological contradictions that imperial institutions never successfully resolved. The ecclesiarchy proclaimed him to be the God Emperor of mankind, while simultaneously acknowledging that he had originally rejected all forms of religious worship. This paradox was typically resolved through increasingly elaborate doctrinal explanations that emphasized the emperor's transcendence of normal human understanding, though such explanations satisfied faith more than reason. The influence that proved indestructible despite the emperor's apparent death was his vision of human supremacy, though this vision was transformed in ways that would have been unrecognizable to its original architect. The confident humanism of the Great Crusade became a xenophobic authoritarianism that viewed all non-human life as inherently threatening to human survival. The rational principles that had originally governed imperial expansion were replaced by religious zealotry that justified any atrocity in service to the emperor's supposed will. The continuing effects that extended beyond expectations included the gradual evolution of human consciousness itself, under the influence of the emperor's psychic presence. Each generation of humans born within the Imperium displayed slightly higher rates of psychic sensitivity, creating new challenges and opportunities that imperial institutions struggled to manage effectively. The species was slowly evolving toward the psychic transcendence that the emperor had originally envisioned, but the process was chaotic and uncontrolled rather than guided and purposeful. The suggestion that the emperor's story might not be finished gained credibility as evidence accumulated of his continuing influence on imperial affairs. Miraculous victories against impossible odds, the timely appearance of resources when they were most desperately needed, and the consistent failure of chaos forces to achieve their ultimate objectives, all suggested the presence of a guiding intelligence that transcended normal human capabilities. Whether this represented the emperor's conscious intervention, or simply the unconscious expression of human devotion remained unknowable. The most troubling aspect of the emperor's long-term legacy was the way his sacrifice had created conditions that perpetuated the very problems he had originally sought to solve. His eternal vigilance against chaos corruption prevented humanity's complete destruction, but it also prevented the species from developing the independence and strength that would make such protection unnecessary. The Imperium had become dependent on his continued suffering in ways that made his recovery or replacement impossible without risking catastrophic collapse. The technological stagnation that characterized imperial civilization was directly traceable to the emperor's decision to suppress knowledge of chaos and the warp rather than educating humanity about these threats. His well-intentioned secrecy had created a civilization that was vulnerable to the very forces he sought to protect them from, while his absence prevented the development of alternative approaches that might have been more effective. The species remained trapped in a cycle of ignorance and vulnerability that his continued presence both perpetuated and mitigated. The cultural transformation from rational enlightenment to religious fanaticism represented a fundamental betrayal of everything the emperor had originally stood for, yet it also provided the psychological foundation that enabled humanity to survive in a universe that had proved far more hostile than he had anticipated. The imperial cult that worshipped him as a god was the antithesis of his original vision, but it also provided the unity and purpose that held human civilization together in the face of threats that would have destroyed a more rational and individualistic society. As the 41st millennium approached, the long-term consequences of the emperor's reign and sacrifice were becoming increasingly apparent in ways that suggested a culmination or transformation of the patterns that had governed human history for 10,000 years. The return of Primarchs, the opening of the Great Rift, and the escalating conflicts with Chaos forces all pointed toward a crisis that would test whether the civilization the emperor had built could survive the challenges that his own success had created. The modern discoveries about the emperor's true nature and continuing influence have only deepened the fundamental mysteries surrounding his existence, while simultaneously revealing the staggering scope of his impact on human consciousness and galactic civilization. Recent events in the 41st millennium, particularly the return of Robout Guilliman and the opening of the Great Rift, have provided new evidence that the Emperor's presence on the Golden Throne represents far more than the mere preservation of a dying consciousness sustained by technological intervention. Guilliman's first-hand account of his encounter with the Emperor has shattered many long-held assumptions about the nature of the being enthroned beneath the Imperial Palace. The Primarch describes not a withered corpse clinging to existence, but a transcendent entity whose consciousness operates on scales that exceed mortal understanding. The Emperor's communication with his resurrected son was not verbal but psychic, conveying concepts and emotions that human language lacks the capacity to express. Most disturbing was Guilliman's realization that the father he remembered from the Great Crusade may have been only a small fraction of what the Emperor truly was. How the Emperor's psychic presence still affects current events in the 41st millennium has become increasingly apparent as Imperial forces report phenomena that can only be explained by direct divine intervention. The miraculous appearance of the Legion of the Damned at crucial moments, the inexplicable failure of Chaos rituals that should have succeeded, and the consistent emergence of Imperial saints during times of greatest crisis all point toward a guiding intelligence that actively shapes events across the galaxy. These interventions are not random or arbitrary, but follow patterns that suggest a consciousness capable of processing information on a galactic scale while simultaneously maintaining awareness of individual human struggles. The implications of the Emperor's potential awakening represent both humanity's greatest hope and its most terrifying nightmare. Theological scholars within the ecclesiarchy have long debated whether the Emperor's eventual resurrection would herald a new golden age of human expansion or trigger the final apocalypse that would consume the galaxy in psychic fire. Recent events suggest that this awakening may already be underway, as reports of his presence in the warp have intensified to the point where even non-psychers can sometimes sense his attention focused upon them. The connections to ongoing 40K narratives reveal that the Emperor's story is inextricably linked to every major development in contemporary Imperial history. The opening of the Great Rift was not merely a consequence of the 13th Black Crusade's success, but appears to have been a deliberate action by the Emperor to prevent an even greater catastrophe. The psychic maelstrom that now bisects the galaxy serves as both a barrier against Chaos expansion and a conduit for the Emperor's influence, allowing him to project his power across distances that would previously have been impossible to span. The return of the Primarchs during this critical period appears to be more than coincidence, suggesting that the Emperor has been orchestrating events across 10 millennia to position his greatest creations where they would be most needed when the final crisis arrived. Guilliman's resurrection was not a random miracle, but the culmination of careful planning that began during the heresy itself, while the mysterious disappearances of other Primarchs may have been strategic deployments rather than abandonment or death. The philosophical questions about godhood, sacrifice, and humanity's future that have surrounded the Emperor since his entombment have taken on new urgency as evidence accumulates of his continuing evolution beyond mortal understanding. The being who once rejected worship as incompatible with human dignity now derives his power from the faith of trillions of believers, creating a feedback loop that may be transforming him into something that transcends the categories of mortality and divinity that once defined him. The most troubling implication of these developments is that the Emperor's transformation may be irreversible, making it impossible for him to return to the rational scientific worldview that originally motivated his grand design. The entity that emerges from the Golden Throne may be more God than man, more symbol than individual consciousness, shaped by the expectations and beliefs of his worshippers rather than his original intentions and desires. This possibility raises fundamental questions about identity, consciousness, and the relationship between belief and reality that challenge basic assumptions about the nature of existence itself. What the Emperor's story means for the galaxy's ultimate fate depends largely on whether his current trajectory leads toward apotheosis or dissolution. If his consciousness continues to expand and evolve, he may eventually achieve the transcendence that he originally sought for all humanity, becoming a force for order and progress that could guide the species toward a truly golden age. Alternatively, the strain of maintaining his psychic vigilance for 10,000 years may be approaching the limits of even his superhuman endurance, threatening a collapse that would leave humanity defenseless against the forces of chaos. The evidence suggests that the Emperor's story is approaching a crucial transition point where the patterns that have governed human civilization for 10 millennia will either be transcended or catastrophically broken. The increasing frequency of his interventions, the return of the Primarchs, and the escalating conflicts with chaos forces all point toward a climax that will determine whether humanity achieves the destiny the Emperor originally envisioned or falls into darkness deeper than anything experienced during the Age of Strife. The modern mysteries surrounding the Emperor's nature have revealed that he may never have been entirely human in the conventional sense, but rather something that existed at the intersection between mortality and divinity from the very beginning of his recorded existence. His mastery of genetic manipulation, psychic powers, and temporal perception may have been manifestations of a consciousness that operated according to principles that transcended normal biological or physical limitations. This possibility reframes his entire relationship with humanity as not the elevation of a human to godlike status, but the voluntary limitation of a godlike being to human form. The implications of this interpretation are staggering in their scope and significance. If the Emperor was always something more than human, then his sacrifice on behalf of humanity represents not just personal tragedy, but cosmic significance, a voluntary acceptance of suffering and limitation by a being who possessed the power to reshape reality according to his will. His choice to remain bound to the Golden Throne, despite possessing the ability to transcend physical existence entirely, becomes an act of love and dedication that validates humanity's faith in him while simultaneously calling into question their worthiness of such sacrifice. The suggestion that the Emperor's story may not be over gains additional credibility from the cyclical nature of imperial history, where patterns of decline and renewal seem to repeat on scales measured in millennia rather than centuries. The current crisis facing the Imperium bears striking similarities to the conditions that prevailed during the Age of Strife, suggesting that humanity may be approaching another transformative period that will either elevate the species to unprecedented heights or reduce it to primitive barbarism once again. The final implications of the Emperor's story for the grim darkness of the far future are both hopeful and terrifying in their potential. His continued presence offers the possibility that humanity's suffering has meaning and purpose, that the sacrifices demanded by imperial civilization serve some greater design that will ultimately justify their cost. However, the same evidence suggests that this purpose may require sacrifices so vast and transformations so fundamental that the humanity that emerges from the process may be unrecognizable to those who initiated it. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Emperor of mankind remains humanity's greatest champion and its most terrible burden, a god who rejected godhood now sustained by the faith of trillions, while his consciousness fights an eternal war in the depths of the warp. His story is humanity's story, written in blood and fire across the stars, and its ending remains unwritten in the dying light of the 41st millennium. Whether that ending brings salvation or damnation may depend less on the Emperor's power than on humanity's willingness to accept the price that transcendence demands, and their capacity to remain human while achieving something greater than humanity has ever imagined possible. The Emperor's legacy ultimately poses the question that defines existence in the 41st millennium: whether the preservation of humanity justifies the sacrifice of everything that makes humans worth preserving, and whether a species can achieve godhood without losing its soul in the process. The answer to that question lies not in the Golden Throne or the Warp, but in the choices made by ordinary humans across the galaxy who must decide whether to embrace the light of the Emperor's vision, or surrender to the darkness that waits beyond the failing borders of his fading empire.